If someone was to ask you to jump from one place on the ground to another, you wouldn't really think it was that difficult of a task, even if it was a couple feet away. But yet, we consider shifting on the fingerboard to sometimes be very challenging, even though the distance we're covering tends to be very small, especially compared to an actual jump. So if you learn to treat shifts like jumps with your hand, you'll find that shifting not only feels more natural, but it becomes much easier to do consistently. But before we get into more, I'm David. I've been playing the violin for over 20 years, teaching for over 10, and making tutorials online for the past 8 years. I studied the Dounis Method, and this method is focused on teaching natural technique using your natural instincts. When we jump, we first bend our knees, more or less depending on the distance of the jump. And when we're traveling in the air, we simply follow this trajectory to the end point. Now that description of jumping with your legs may have been something that you never really thought about, because it all feels so intuitive to do. You never really consciously think about bending your knees more or less, or simply releasing when you jump in the air. You just do it as one motion. And that's the end goal for shifting. When shifting is done correctly, it should feel just as intuitive. And before we get into the mechanics of it, I just want to clarify that the types of shifts we'll be covering in this video are slow shifts. Here's a comparison between the two. Slow shifts, even though they're called slow shifts, can be done in slow or fast passages. But the difference between them and fast shifts is the mechanism that's used. Fast shifts are typically used in scale-like passages, where the fingers are moving closer together, and those can be done in slow or fast passages. But slow shifts also involve the hand and wrist, whereas fast shifts are just done with the fingers. So, let's start working on these slow shifts by taking a simple 1-octave shift, down with the same finger. The first step is to start at the note that you're shifting to. In this case, I'm shifting up 1 octave. Once you get to the note that you're shifting to, lightly tap your finger so that it's balanced and that it feels comfortable, and vibrate. Once you have a comfortable setup on that note that you're shifting to, reach back to the note that you're shifting from with just your hand, no arm. Now when you get back to the note that you're shifting from, you'll notice that your hand shape may seem a bit strange, but you should feel that if you were to release your hand from this position, that it would go back to the note that you're shifting to, like a slingshot. This position that your hand is in when it moves down to the note that you're shifting from is called the intermediate position, and it's a position that you want to be very familiar with when practicing these shifts. Now, as I mentioned, once you release from this intermediate position, you should just end up at the note that you're shifting to, because the way that you got there was by starting at the note you were shifting to, and then reaching back with your hand to set it up. So start by getting comfortable with just finding that intermediate position. And once you're comfortable with finding this intermediate position from the note that you're shifting to, get comfortable with finding the intermediate position from the note that you're shifting from. Now, once you reach this intermediate position, you simply release the hand and let it slingshot to the note that you're shifting to. And while you're shifting, it's very important to feel that you're releasing the string. You shouldn't be pressing down on the string at all with your finger. It should feel like you're just applying harmonic pressure. And one way to get the feeling for releasing the string, which is helpful for other techniques as well, is to take a piece of paper and place it under your finger and to slide up and down the fingerboard like this. This will give you the feeling of what it's like to release the string, and it's also a good exercise for relaxing your fingers. So, let's go over these steps again. Start from the note that you're shifting from and get into the intermediate position. Then when you're in this position, you should feel like your wrist is being pulled towards the note that you're shifting to. Release this position and feel that your hand is slingshotting towards the note that you're shifting to. As you're shifting up the string, you should feel that the string is completely released under your finger. Then you should land on the note that you're shifting to. Now these steps that you do, these are meant to be done when practicing shifts. When you do the shift as one motion when you're playing the piece, you won't actually be breaking it down into all these steps. But these steps are very necessary to practice to get the correct feeling for the shift. Now before we get into practicing the shifting in the opposite direction, you'll notice a couple things in that shift I did. You'll notice that when I shifted normally, you didn't see as big of a bend in my wrist as you did when I was practicing the intermediate position. And that's normal. When you're actually playing a normal shift, as I mentioned earlier, your shift won't look exactly the same as when you're practicing it. But practicing it in that way is very important for getting it consistent. Now, to practice a shift in the opposite direction, it's actually the same exact idea. The only difference is your intermediate position will look different with the wrist bent in the other direction. So in this case, we're shifting down. So we're going to start at the note that we're shifting to, which is in the lower position. Then we're going to reach for the note that we're shifting from, which is in the higher position. And you'll notice that the angle of the wrist is different and it looks bent out when compared to the other intermediate position. So practice getting into this intermediate position before shifting down. And you should feel the exact same thing, that the wrist is being pulled towards the note that you're shifting to. And once you feel that, you should just release the hand and allow the finger to release the string and slingshot to the note that you're shifting to. Practice this in these steps before trying it as just one motion. Now, when doing this exercise correctly, you should feel that as the wrist gets pulled towards the note that you're shifting to, that there's a natural speed that it travels at. You shouldn't be trying to force the note to go faster or slower as this is happening. It should kind of travel at its own speed, in the same way that if you were jumping, you wouldn't be changing the speed of your jump when you're already in the air. The speed of the jump and the speed of the shift are determined before you leave the original note. And this is why the shift is really determined before you ever leave the original note. If your hand is set up correctly every time, then your shift will be consistent pretty much every time. But if you're not really consistent with setting up your shifts, or don't feel really comfortable getting into that intermediate position accurately, then you'll probably have inconsistencies with your shift as well. Now, another exercise to get this feeling into your shifts is to actually practice them as jumps with the hand. When you do this, you're actually going to be jumping from one note to the next, completely releasing the string. Now, it's very important that you actually feel this jumping motion when you're doing the exercise. Otherwise, it won't be as helpful. I find that it's really helpful to actually practice this in front of a mirror. And if you notice that your hand isn't quite moving like an actual jump, you may want to feel that you're actually springing from the wrist, in the same way that you feel like you're springing from your knees when you do a jump with your legs. Now, as I mentioned in the previous exercise, once your hand leaves the original note, its path is already predetermined. So it's important to not change that while you're already in the air. This exercise is also especially helpful for releasing tension in your shifts, or if you feel like your finger is getting stuck during the shifts. And some shifts and passages can actually be done like this too, especially if they cover a large distance. There's two types of shifts you can do in this situation. You can do a classical shift where you're hiding the sound of the shift, or you can do an expressive shift. I generally recommend working on your classical shifts first, because it's always important to be able to hide the sound of the shift when you want to. When doing a classical shift, your shift is done on the old finger. So for example, if you're shifting from the first finger on the old note to the fourth finger on the higher note, then you'll be shifting on the first finger until you reach the new position. Then you'll simply drop down the fourth finger and play the new note. And if you want to make an expressive shift, then you actually do the shift on the new finger. So in that same example, you'll be starting on the first finger on the old note, then you'll be shifting up to the new note on the fourth finger and reach the new note with the fourth finger. Now, it's important to note that both of these shifts were done going up. When you shift going down, the shifts are pretty much always done on the old finger, regardless of whether or not you want a classical or expressive shift. Now, you'll notice that if you want, you could still make the shift hurt a bit even when you're shifting down. And a lot of this has to do with how you're using the bow. You can use the bow to hide or expose the sound of your shift. And this is especially helpful to remember when you want to hide the sound of your shift. And sometimes when you want to highlight your shift and make it more audible, you can shift on a new bow. And that style of shift, where you shift on the new bow with the new finger, is generally called a high fit shift. Now, another way to make your shifts even more consistent is to work on the helper tones. Helper tones are the notes that you play in the new position with the old finger. So for example, when I'm shifting from the first finger in the old position to the fourth finger in the new position, the helper tone would be the note that I play with my first finger in the new position. In this case, the note that my first finger plays in the new position is going to be F sharp. So to practice the helper tone, I'm actually going to practice shifting from the old note in the old position to this F sharp in the new position. Once I get the helper tone, I'm simply going to drop the new finger down in the new position, and that'll be the note that I'm shifting to. Now, as you practice your shifts with these helper tones, gradually hide the helper tones more and more, so that eventually you only hear the note that you're shifting from and the note that you're shifting to. Now, let's try out this method of practice with one of the most famous violin concerto intros, the Saint-Saëns Violin Concerto No. 3. We'll start by identifying the helper tones here. Let's start with that first shift going up. I'm doing the shift going from the second finger to the third finger, so my helper tone will be the note that the second finger plays in the new position. In this case, it's an E natural, so I want to make sure that I hear that when I'm practicing the shift. Now I'm going to work on gradually hiding that helper tone more and more, but I still want to hear it to help me with getting that shift to be more consistent. The next shift, which is the bigger one, is going from the second finger to the third finger again. And so I also want to hear what note my second finger is playing in that new position. In this case, it'll be an A natural. Now, it's also very important to practice those shifts using the previous exercises we talked about, learning the intermediate position and practicing releasing the string. It's always a good idea to try these exercises within the context of a musical passage. I always find that that's the most helpful for actually learning the technique, and it's the most helpful for actually learning how to apply it into your playing. But if you want some simple ways to try out these exercises at first, you can just try by doing the exercises I demonstrated, or by just doing 1 octave shifts on the same string. So how do you practice shifts that involve a string crossing as well? Well, the idea is actually pretty similar, except you do the shift on the old string, meaning that on the old string, you shift up to the new position on the old finger, and then on the new string, you simply place down the new finger. This passage from the cadenza of the Sibelius Concerto is a great example of this. In this case, we're going to shift up on the G string to the new position on the old finger. In this case, I'm doing a shift from the second finger to the third finger on the new note. So I'm going to shift up on the old string, which is the G string, with the second finger. Once you have that helper note on the old string, simply place the new finger down on the new string and play it. You should already be in the position that you need to be. Now, one more tip to also help you in making big shifts like this, especially when they go into a very high position, is to get really comfortable with playing the note that you're shifting to as if it's the first note of the piece. Simply start with your hand by your side and bring it up and play that note that you're shifting to as if it was the first note that you're playing. This will train you to feel comfortable on the note that you're shifting to, and that plays a big role in how consistent your shifts are and with how natural they feel. And when you get comfortable doing that several times in a row, you'll find that your shifts feel easier to do. And that's because you're comfortable with the position that you're shifting to. If you found this video helpful and are interested in learning more on how to develop a natural technique, check out some of the resources below, including my free ebook.